April 27th, 2014. My name is Christina Bennett, and I am here in the Senior Physiologist Lounge in the San Diego Convention Center at the annual meeting of the American Physiological Society. Today I have the pleasure and the honor to interview Dr. Roland Blantz for the Society's Living History Project. Dr. Blantz is a long-standing APS member who has been affiliated with the University of California, San Diego. Dr. Blantz's research has focused on renal physiology and pathophysiology. Dr. Blantz.
Yes.
Welcome to the Living History Project, and thank you for agreeing to be interviewed for the series. If you are ready, I'd like to ask you a few questions.
Sure.
About your career. Okay. So can you tell us about your family upbringing and what led you to a career in science?
Well, I grew up in Portland, Oregon, a state north of here, about 1,000 miles. And I grew up in a family which was not scientific by any means. My father had a master's degree in Romance languages or something like that. But as I grew up, he was a high voltage lineman, because after the Depression, I guess, and I was born in 1940, that's where the best paying jobs were, not teaching school. And so I grew up in a household where I think he later became an executive in life, but science was not really part of the issues. And I grew up in a largely Irish-German family, like everybody else in the United States, it seems like, at that time. And in high school and I think I was in grade school considered a bit of a problem because I talked all the time in class. But other than that, my hobbies were mostly music and athletics. I sang a lot, and I played the trombone and the piano, and sang in my choir. I was a soloist in my choir, actually, in high school.
Impressive.
And still sing in the symphony chorus here at San Diego. But so music took up a lot of my time. I can't say that science took up any of my time particularly. And I did football and track in high school. But I guess in high school I did pretty well in school, particularly math. And as you may recall, that was about the time that Sputnik went up. And so we were trying to supposedly catch up with the Russians, and so all of our high school advisors said, oh, you've got to go into science or mathematics or engineering. So there was a lot of pressure in that direction, I suppose. And I went to an excellent public school that actually had it was called a Ford Foundation Gifted Child Program, where we had small classes. So I did a lot of stuff in physics and math and English and social studies too. But there was pressure to apply to the best possible school you could get in. And so I know there were 2 of us or 3 of us from a public high school graduating class of 400 that went back east to school. And so I went back east to Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, and was primarily interested initially in chemistry or possibly chemical engineering. So that's where my background sort of translocated. I was lucky enough to get some scholarships to go.
Neat. And do you have a favorite professor that steered you more towards making science a career?
Well, that would be much later, I suppose. I guess during college, my major was chemical engineering, and my minor, a lot of East Coast schools required you to have a minor if you were a geek in science, and mine was history. And I liked those courses too. And so I was sort of torn about what graduate programs I might be interested in. So I thought about applying to law school, business school, because I didn't want to be a PhD in engineering, and there didn't seem to be too much point in that. And so I applied to one of the few med schools that would accept me without a full bunch of biology courses. So I applied to Stanford, University of Chicago, and Johns Hopkins there in Baltimore, and was fortunate enough to get in, and decided med school was a little bit better option than law or business. Maybe I made the wrong choice, but and throughout med school, it was an interesting experience because our class, and this is a point I'd like to make later, our class was selected on the basis of MCAT scores, or medical college aptitude tests. So we didn't have many pre-meds. I have nothing against pre-meds per se, but there were a minority of our class were actually pre-meds. So we had a mixtures of history majors, engineers, physics majors, a wide diversity. And even for Johns Hopkins, that has a fairly high percentage of academic graduates, 62% of our class was full-time academic people, which I think must be nearly the highest of any graduating class. And I usually attribute that to the fact that the class was quite diverse in terms of its educational background. I was interested in surgery, spent a lot of time with the surgeons, but decided to go into internal medicine because I was more or less interested in intensive care unit type things, and decided against critical care and opted for nephrology later.
Yeah, so how did your research interests gear towards nephrology?
Well, to tell you the truth, the choice of nephrology was based on clinical issues, really, rather than research, because nephrologists have an opportunity to see very sick people in the ICU, in the OB setting, and in medical ICUs. So the diversity of internal medicine and surgical problems that you see, especially post-op trauma, et cetera, was quite broad. I suppose infectious disease and nephrology were the two subspecialties that saw a broad range of things. And if I wasn't going to be a surgeon, I decided that I could take care of post-surgical patients too. And so the initial decision, I think, was based on nephrology, but also, as you will find out, I guess, from talking to other medical subspecialties, nephrologists tend to be a little more quantitative. They like numbers. I mean, like acid-base problems, fluid and electrolyte problems, people with kidney failure, dialyzing people, things like that. So I think somebody with a math background and interest, maybe even with a chemical engineering background, the clinical and research opportunities seem to be fairly great in nephrology. And at that time, let's say in the early 70s when I was a fellow, I think nephrology was considered to be a fairly hot area research-wise in physiology. It was before dialysis became the dominant clinical issue. It was more, micropuncture was big, sodium transport was big, and it was fairly big in both Europe and the US in terms of kidney physiology being important, and it had a certain appeal in the same way that the clinical did. You know, it was a very quantitatively and very regulatory oriented, if you understand. How does patient A get from base to B? Not just what does he have, but how did it happen?
Right,
you know?
right.
So it had a regulatory component to it.
Interesting. And do you have any people that influenced your career?
Very much so. I don't think it's possible for me to name anybody from med school too much, or maybe house staff, but I was a fellow at University of Texas Southwestern Med School in Dallas, which at that time was one of the prominent research-oriented places in the country. NIH, a place in San Francisco, maybe, and one in Boston. They were doing micropuncture, isolated tubular perfusion, and it was kind of an interesting research fellowship, which I was dominantly a research fellow. Most of the fellows were from other countries. Recruited my two major mentors were Donald Selden, who was chairman of medicine in Dallas, and a guy named Floyd Rector, who was head of nephrology, both of whom were basic physiologists by instinct, but MDs. And I would say 60–70% of the research fellows were from outside the country that had decided to come there for specific types of training. Japan, France, Brazil, Australia, Canada. And there were very few of us that were actually US people. And so we ended up having a lot of highly committed people. And Rector and Selden were hard taskmasters. They demanded that you not only do the research, but you perform, you present it, you defend it, and they didn't encourage trivial research. They liked you to be doing new things and hotshot things that were considered to be, but not necessarily disease related, but they were interested in how the kidney works on a very basic elemental level, but with kind of a regulatory influence to it.
Interesting, yeah. And so did you run your own lab?
I have. I recently retired, so I'm not technically running that lab, but I was chief of nephrology for about 25 years at UCSD, but our physiology group is about 6 or 7 faculty level people, MDs and PhDs. And yeah, we do mostly rodent and mouse and rat physiology, but also some molecular stuff as well.
And what has been your most significant contribution to physiology?
It's a little bit hard to say, but I would say 2 general areas, I guess, come to mind. When I was a fellow, I developed some techniques along with another group at NIH and then later San Francisco to determine by direct measurements how glomerular filtration was regulated. In other words, everybody knew that it did change and that it changed correlating with various things like blood flow, et cetera. But the specifics of why it changed, was lacking because there was an absence of direct measurements. So we utilized a strain of rat that have glomeruli, the little filtering unit, on the surface of the kidney, and little vessels that you can collect blood from. And you can measure pressures in all these structures, takes blood samples, but you have to do it in a highly efficient fashion. And it led us for a long time to make some contributions in how the normal kidney regulates filtration, which was a little bit different than what was thought before. Not our lab only, but one other lab prominently too, now in Boston. And then later allowed us to ask questions of like, in pathophysiology, why with acute kidney injury or why with chronic kidney disease is the GFR changing? Why is it going down? We could supply some direct evidence that was highly objective and formulate cause and effect relationships because of that. And then later, I suppose, we were also interested in how some of these regulatory systems that allow the tubule to talk to the filtering unit, called tubular glomerular feedback. Not that we decided to do it first. The Germans initially proved that this relationship existed. I think our issue was to then translocate those observations into a whole kidney preparation and ask the question, how important is this regulatory system to normal physiology? How does it adapt? And how does it exist in various diseases like acute kidney injury, the diabetic kidney? And later, how does that relate to the metabolism of the kidney? So I'd say mainly our interest has been regulatory phenomena. In other words, not does something happen, but how did it happen or why did it happen?
Interesting. It's a lot of research.
Yeah.
And do you remember your first APS meeting?
Yeah, actually I do, because I think, I started coming to APS meetings when I was a fellow to present posters or things like that, but I continued doing that when I came first to UCSD. UCSD was kind of a new med school at that time, and I was looking for interactions with other physiologists. And at that time, American Society of Nephrology meeting was a little bit smaller, and the APS meeting was a larger get-together of a larger number of people. So I suppose in the early 70s, I started coming to the EB or APS meetings pretty early on. Can't remember where all of them were located. They moved around. And for that reason, I suppose I interacted with a lot of either non-MD or non-clinical physiologists, more so than you might happen now if I were 30 or 35 years old. I think that was good. I mean, in other words, we started showing that there were MDs that were interested in how the kidney works, you know, aside from a clinical setting, and found that we had common interest. And in a way, it evolved so that our laboratory and others have evolved so that there are mixtures between MDs and PhDs, because there are some advantages, because MDs to some degree have a more horizontal training in a sense. The PhDs maybe have a little more vertical but intense training, and it's kind of a good admixture of the two to have people with an engineering background mixed up with people that have a highly intense biological training.
Right. And do you see anything that's changed from your first meeting to the current APS meeting?
Well, I think, and you can blame me in part because I was president of the American Society of Nephrology, but I think that the nephrology meetings have become very big and scientific. And in a sense, that has been too bad in a way, because it sort of tends to separate the PhD basic science department people from people that are in more clinical departments, because some of the clinical divisions have become quite large, like ours has 38 people in it or something, and ones in Boston have 50 or more. They're bigger than basic science departments, actually. So sometimes people feel they don't have to move outside of themselves to interact with people. In the 70s, it just seemed like there were a few less of us, and there was a lot more reason to go to a meeting like that, because the ASN was still fairly small and maybe a little bit more clinically oriented.
And what role has APS played in your career?
Well, quite a bit in terms of, again, the opportunity to interact with a variety of basic scientists on symposia over the years. And in the 90s, I was associate editor of American Journal of Physiology Renal for 6 years, something like that. That was a good experience. And then later that led me to be associate editor of Journal of Clinical Investigation, which is a little more, not totally physiologic, but at least the AJP experiments gave me a lot of experience in the not so computer-based era where you actually did something by writing it down and sending something in, with how to evaluate other people's manuscripts. And for that, I'm quite grateful. I mean, it gave me an opportunity to take a look at that. And also, sitting on NIH study sections, we interacted with people that were from basic science departments and not just clinical departments. I think it's kind of too bad, in a way, that there's been a divergence. I sense a divergence between the PhD-trained people and the MD-trained people. You wouldn't think so at this meeting, because there are a lot of MDs and PhDs, but I just don't think the practical opportunity for interaction is quite as intense as it might have been 30 or 40 years ago, especially for young people starting out. At that time, I didn't have a lot of other physiologists in my faculty that were interested in the same thing I was interested in, so I went to those kind of meetings for the interactions that it provided. And I didn't necessarily write papers with them or write grants with them, but it was an opportunity for discussion, at least. And then, of course, also some of the summer things were also very handy. I know that, well, one of your earlier speakers here today, Gabby Navarre and I and a few other people, put together the first Saxons River, Vermont renal hemodynamics meetings, which are now 25 years old, I suppose, at least, in which you go for a whole week and you just talk about renal function hemodynamics in a rather remote setting in Vermont.
It's full focus on the science, huh?
Well, not entirely. I mean, I must admit there was some beer drinking and a few other things. But, well, no, a lot of soccer, actually, baseball games, canoeing on some river up there, and acting immature.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
It's getting to know your colleagues then, building
Well,
a
no, all
network.
academicians are immature, basically.
Oh. And what advice do you have for students in graduate school today?
An MD or a PhD? I'm not so sure. You know,
Well, we can do an MD first.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we're in a program. UCSD is kind of a unique place because up until the 80s, there were no basic science departments. So all of the basic science was expected to take place in clinical-based departments because of the design of the school. And it was thought to be a basic research-oriented med school. So that meant that 30% of our department were PhDs and 70% MDs. So we've always had, we teach basic science to the first 2 years of med students. So I'm used to seeing what they have to know and have to learn. And I've sat on PhD committees even for oceanography at UCSD. But what I would say particularly, it's maybe a little less true of the PhDs, but especially for the MD, is like from my own standpoint, I think that the med school admissions committees are far too narrow in their perspective of who to take as a medical student. Because if you're only interested in someone that's prepared to deliver clinical care, it's probably okay to have 19% pre-meds. But most of the schools of medicine admissions committee require an awful lot of biology, but they don't require much math. They don't require much in the way of other majors, you know what I mean? And to tell you the truth, I think biology is probably one of the least useful courses to go to med school. In other words, knowing what a frog did doesn't necessarily tell you anything about anything. And many of the people that we have taken into fellowship that were very bright MDs found that they were very limited in their desire to be an academic researcher because they didn't have enough math, they didn't have enough chemistry, they didn't have enough things that you only learn really well when you're 20 years old, and you don't learn very well when you're 35. Mm-hmm. I think it's a shame because I think there are plenty of people out there, given an opportunity, if they had a better basic quantitative chemistry background, could go a long way in research, but they see a glass ceiling, I think, that is real.
Interesting, yeah. And what about for PhDs? Do you think they're receiving the same opportunities to study the kidney? Or?
Well, I think for the most part, if someone thinks they want a PhD in physiology, they often have very heavily biologically oriented pre-graduate school, and I think that's a bit of a mistake too. I think they're not really, if you take a look at what people are doing there are people that are doing pretty high measurement science things that they'd be better off with an electrical engineering degree almost, and if you've just had courses in embryology and stuff like that, that doesn't help very much in figuring out exactly how to run a laboratory, which is primarily things like how do you do the microcircuit for a pressure device that's measuring something in a 5-micron size vessel or something like that. You know, you don't do that without being fairly handy or understanding the structural things of how to make the whole thing work. And I'm not saying you have to be a bona fide engineer to do that, but I think you have to at least understand the principles. And particularly, engineering has a lot of regulatory components to it. In other words, you're not looking at static systems. And I'm not saying anything against molecular biology, but you also have to run an experiment which works within a certain typical time frame. If you're a molecular biologist, you might be able to take that tissue, put it in the -80 refrigerator, and come back the next day and finish. You can't do that if you're working on a rat. In other words, it has to all work that day within a time frame that's constrained. Either that or your data is all over the map, you know.
So
And I'm not being totally critical of that approach, but I think what I said about the MDs in terms of breadth of background is also partially true of the PhDs. And they should be thinking about biologic graduate schools with a heavier emphasis on people that are outside of just biology as their degrees.
So taking their integrative expertise and bringing it to
Yeah, but
a
you
new
have to go
system.
back and also convince people who are in engineering program that why not consider research as an area. I think in MDs now you're seeing a lot of people that are of those backgrounds. They're going into MRI or they're going into what I consider routine radiology stuff because they've got a background. And we can see it in freshmen that we teach physiology to. The kidney has a very, very quantitative orientation to it and regulatory orientation, linking metabolism and function, et cetera. And we find that we have excellent students at UCSD that come from really good places. And about 40% of them like that approach. About 60% of them, you know, they're half-half about to have something described in an equation or a thermodynamic principle kind of turns off a lot of them, you know, like they're not saying, gee, where did the hand holding go that I was supposed to be learning in med school? It's not quite that bad, but it's just that some of them have what I call integralophobia. In other words, if you show somebody an equation, they say, gee, I don't want to hear about this. And it's more a question of background or what kind of people did you pick to be in med school.
And has your teaching style changed over the years to reach a new set of medical students each year and to encourage them to think
We're dealt
about
the
renal
hand we
physiology?
have, you know, I mean, yeah, you have to be a bit of a populist. I mean, you know, I'm not saying Juan Perón, but you have to get up there and bring them to a problem and sort of, you can't just go up there and say we're going to talk about Math 101 for how the kidney works, but you have to sort of say that there are some peculiar things about the kidney. Like, for example, after they've already had cardiology or they've already had cardiovascular research, you know, you have to come in and say, well, what's peculiar about my organ? Well, in the heart, with the heart pumping, whether it's got an infarct or whether it's got something wrong with it, I can't imagine any circumstances where increase in coronary blood flow wouldn't be good for the heart or good for the body, okay? The kidney, it's not that simple because once you increase blood flow, you increase filtration, you increase tubular reabsorption, you increase metabolic work and demand. So having an increase in blood flow may not always be good for you because the subtleties between supply and demand are very, very complex. It depends on whether the tubule has been injured, this and that. So you can try to bring it in under a clinical smokescreen that sort of leads them into understanding why there's some complexities about the physiology of our organ that, to some extent, the heart is a simple organ. It's a pump. It's only got 2 or 3 different cell types. The kidney's far more complicated and understanding. And some people are sort of turned off by saying, I don't need to know those details. They can go into orthopedic surgery.
and so when you look back on your career, is there a moment or a time in your career that made you most pleased with your choice or happy to be a part of the community? And
well, I think growing up in a med school that started in 1968 through 70 here at UCSD has been a very good experience for me. Going from, I think there were 2 or 3 of us in nephrology when I came in 73 and 72. And now it's a pretty established, bigger system. So the recruitment has been interesting in developing a cadre of colleagues. And I enjoyed my 7 years as counselor and president and past president of the American Society of Nephrology too, because that was during a period of time that we were trying to sell the importance of the kidney to the world, and we came across the data that there were maybe 25 million people that had chronic kidney disease. I don't think the world was in general aware of the magnitude of that problem and how it contributed to other health issues like cardiovascular disease. So some of this sort of salesmanship idea of make your organ important was important not just from a physiologic standpoint, but just from the standpoint of future funding, you know, and convincing people that this area of either clinical or translational or basic investigation was important because it had a healthcare impact, you know. And understanding how the kidney works on its own without disease is what Dr. Selden and Rector told us was necessary for you to be able to function either as a clinician or a researcher. You have to know how the normal organ works and the subtleties thereof.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah. So do you have any other stories or reflections that you'd like to share?
Stories.
A good one.
A good story. Oh, that puts me on the spot here. Well, I think that basically the other thing that I've learned, I think, from academia is MDs and PhDs, but particularly MDs, you know, I think, they have to decide earlier in their career, and I hope I'm not being pedantic about this, you have to understand whether you're going to, everybody knows you have to be a decent researcher to become a fairly prominent person in your division or department. But I think you have to decide very early, what kind of style am I? Am I a person that wants to do basic research as a primary raison d'etre, or is the research really a stepping stone towards something that you think you will do better, which is running an organization, like a division or a department, or even being a dean. I mean, all those talents are required, but I think that one has to decide what type of image you may, in your primitive form as a postdoc, think, gee, this life as an academic researcher looks great to me. But I think you have to be honest with yourself and sort of say, is the research a means to an end? And that end is really running things? Because there are a lot of Peter principles that are operative in academia where you may be a great researcher and you think you want to be a department chair and you're horrible. Or vice versa, that you're sort of a somewhat mediocre researcher, but what you're really good at is running an organization. And I think people often don't have enough self-examination, or when you recruit people, you're not quite sure exactly what kind of person am I actually dealing with here. And it's very difficult to tell sometimes early on which of those people's talents, because both talents are required at all levels, but I must admit myself, me personally, if I had more than 2 grants, you know, I had trouble keeping control of what was going on, you know. Whereas there are other people that can run a lab with 30, 35 fellows and have an organization where they have lieutenants and colonels and all this, like a military battalion, you know, and they do that perfectly all right. But I think you have to decide early on which one of those kind of people you are.
Yeah, it's a small business owner or a research enterprise.
Yeah, president of GM.
Yeah, yeah.
Provided the key works in the ignition.
Right, and all we come in with is a MD or PhD degree, not the whole management training.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I've really enjoyed this opportunity for you to participate in the Living History project, and I've learned a lot, and I think it was really great to meet you.
Thank you.
Thank you.